it is so easy to connect with people from around the world. And I think, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's great to foster community and to connect with like-minded folks like yourself. And it's great for using technology and social media, especially to advocate and to get that message out to the world and inspire other people to take action. And with, technological advances like AI and things like that, I think it does make things more efficient. And I think we can leverage it as a tool to making our movements grow and, in our digital advocacy work. But on the other hand, you have this kind of vulnerability of so much access. And with your digital footprint, I know there's a lot of rhetoric right now on TikTok about protecting minors online. Whether that's, posting about them, putting them in videos and things like that, because you don't know who's watching your content. There's so many layers of like needing to protect young people from online.
The Ms. Texas Show is a voice of hope for victims, survivors, advocates, and community leaders against gender-based violence to share their stories and resources. We began showcasing life in Texas. Today we are impacting lives not only in Texas, but also around the world. Under our segment Military Time, we run this segment in partnership with the National Veterans Chamber of Commerce. We invite military and veterans who have overcome traumatic events to share their experiences during and after their military service. Under our beauty segment, we invite fellow pageant winners and contestants, artists, musicians, actors, models, and dancers, and last but not least, our survivor leaders from family violence, sex trafficking, sexual assault, stalking, and other traumatic events who are ambassadors for these causes to share their lives and the impact they have made. To become a guest on our show, email us at MsUSATexas@gmail.com. If you would like to support victims and survivors of gender-based violence, make a tax-deductible donation to Hope Pyx Global at www.hopyxglobal.org.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the MsTexasShow. And today we have a very special guest, Miss Rachel McCave. She is the Senior Associate for UNA for Youth Engagement. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be invited to have this conversation today.
Rachel and I have spent a lot of time trying to schedule this meeting because of your busy schedule. And, I absolutely loved your passion about the work that you do. And that's how we, how our paths is crossed. So tell us more about you and what you do and what exactly you do, because everyone is fascinated about the great work that the UN is doing. So what you do and what brought you here? Why are you doing this?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I think I'll start off with kind of what led me to this work. So a bit about my personal background. I've always been interested in traveling the world and experiencing other cultures and kind of bringing people together. And I always found myself thinking very deeply about society and how society works and society's issues. And so really my academic background kind of started in cultural anthropology and trying to understand social justice issues. And then that led me to studying international relations and traveling abroad and working for various organizations at the United Nations on different advocacy issues. But when it comes to ending violence against women and gender equality specifically, for me, unfortunately, I experienced situations in my early adulthood that made me a survivor. And I think I was able to turn that experience into kind of what led me, turn that into passion for ensuring that something like that doesn't happen to other young women and making sure that the next generation is protected, but also empowered and educated. And so my work now at UNA USA and youth engagement is really focused on providing young people, a voice at the United Nations and equipping them with the skills to take local action in their communities, whether that's localizing the SDGs, getting involved in social issues at a local level. And then, of course, we have different programs where we kind of serve as a conduit in connecting young people to the United Nations. So whether that's through our events, we have over 140 campus chapters across the United States, I should say, where we work with different colleges and universities to help continuing educate students about what it means to be a global citizen, what it means to take local action on these, global issues that we always hear about, and just overall providing a sense of community for young people to really feel included in global advocacy and specifically the work of the United Nations.
That's amazing. I mean, to turn your personal experience into the passion and use this positive influence to now influence the youth and influence the world. I just cannot say enough thank you for the work that you do.
Yeah, of course. And I think for me too, when something like that happens, you can feel like your power has been stripped away, right? And I think there's a lot of shame in secrecy, and there's a lot of shame in silence, whether that's people silencing you, not believing your story, not wanting to hear your story, or just feeling like, you can't share your story, or you don't have the resources to seek justice and, things like that for your story. And so I think there's power to acknowledging the things that happen to you, but then turning that into what drives you forward to create a better world.
Well, it's so well said. And to be honest, this is the theme of our podcast, The Voice of Hope. So we want to have the voice of survivors, voice of advocates, and everyone who is here for those who, whether, for whatever reason, they cannot speak yet, or unfortunately, some of them has passed. I recall that I was chatting with a lady recently. There's an event. I'm based out of Houston, Texas, and from Galveston, that's the island over there. So every year, the DA's office have the Tree of Angels. And I've been invited to attend that event, and it was heartbreaking because each angel is representing a person who is deceased from the violence. And I'm just sitting here thinking, what can we do to turn this around? And that's what you're doing exactly. And I just commend you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Yeah, but also I would like to address the matter of shame. And can you tell us more, educate our audience more about the shame? Because some of them might not have experienced that. Some of them might be going through that. And I had my own experience of shame, which I have come out of it. But what would you tell the audience about shame, and what can they do to overcome that?
Yeah, I think, with shame, it can be a very tricky thing. And I think it can follow you for a lot of your life if you don't sort of address it. And I think there's a lot of different ways people process and work through shame. But I think for me, a few things that have kind of helped. The first thing I think is speaking truth to power and just telling your story. I think the more you allow yourself the space, whether that's to process, to grieve, to share your story, I think the more you share your story, the more you can define how you want to move forward from that point on for yourself. And I think that reminds you of your own agency to say, okay, yes, now I can share my story, but I don't let it define me. I get to decide how the rest of my life looks from this point onwards. And I think speaking truth to that power inside of yourself and to your story also helps other people understand that, this is a very common occurrence, unfortunately, and you're not alone. And I think shame can be very isolating. So I think when you share your story with other people, and as people relate to you and relate to each other around, this issue, I think that helps kind of reduce some of that shame, which leads me to my next point, which is about community. I think when you find community of people to generally support you, whether that's, your family or your chosen family, whether that's friends, support groups, or even just advocacy groups. I know with UNA USA, we have a really strong sense of community with over 20,000 members. And so finding people who also care about this issue and, making sure this doesn't happen for other people, wherever you can find community, I think is very powerful in terms of reducing some of that shame around this topic.
I totally agree. Like Rachel said, you're not alone, that there's a community here to support you. A lot of the people, they might be immigrants, and a lot of the people might not even know, even if they're US citizens. Not everyone were born to say, okay, I need to know that. And unfortunately, because of that, they get victimization and they become victims. But I don't like to call them victims. I call them survivors. But that's the reality, that we really need to bring the education to this realm and to really see, what we can do to support them. And I totally, absolutely admire the passion of of what you mentioned, the 20,000 members and what all is doing in this field and with their, areas of expertise, whether they're youth. And I have met either in person or virtually some of the youth that are the leaders. And going back to what you said, your work, what you're doing now to lead the youth, and you said about the campus chapters. I'm aware that the campus chapter do the global classroom, do the model UN, and there's like a lot of leadership opportunities. I was wondering if you can tell our audience, maybe there are youth who are interested in getting involved, or maybe even, start a new campus chapter or anything. What can they do to get involved?
Yeah, well, first I want to acknowledge that in the time that I've, started my early career and up until now helping create these programs for youth, I've seen a huge shift in how the UN specifically has welcomed youth at, these decision-making tables. I think there's so much more opportunities and resources available now within the global advocacy space that do center youth voices and uplift and empower youth leaders. So I'm really glad that, UNAUSA is a big part of that. But yeah, I'm happy to share a bit more about how specifically we engage youth, specifically in advocacy at UNAUSA. So as you mentioned, our campus chapters, and really that's kind of our main way that we engage youth in their local communities, right? So we have campus chapters across the United States. And as you can imagine, some states, people are a lot more engaged in global issues and have a bigger awareness of the United Nations than other areas. And so we work really hard to get to those harder to reach areas and more rural areas where maybe the UNAUSA Club is the only organization in an area where people are learning about global issues in the United Nations. And so we really pride ourselves on empowering our chapter leaders at these campus chapters to fully understand the SDGs and what advocacy looks like and making that relevant to their local area. And so that's kind of the biggest way that our campus chapters engage in these issues. So it's one thing to understand, on a global scale, what's going on in the world in terms of gender equality and peace and security and climate change. But it's another thing to look at your own community and say, okay, what's happening in my own backyard? How is this impacting me and my friends and my family and the people we know in this community? And what can I do about it? Whether that's, getting them in touch with their local legislators, local organizations, and things like that. But what I will say was, I think an important point in terms of the UN and the SDGs and localizing that work is that there's so much intersectionality with these different issues. And so we're talking about gender equality and ending violence against women. But as you mentioned, with marginalized groups and vulnerable populations, that is tied to education, that's tied to, income equality, that's tied to climate change, that's tied to immigration and housing. And so all of these issues intersect in so many different ways. And so being able to connect people to each other, to get them first talking about these different issues and bringing their own expertise to the table is one way that we've been really able to kind of, put wind under our sails, if that's the saying, and really give power to these local initiatives is by understanding that they all feed into each other and all these issues are so interconnected. So yeah, our campus chapters are really our main way of doing that. But of course, we also have our youth observer to the UN, who really kind of serves as a huge voice for all of our youth members in spaces, at the State Department and with, government officials and at the United Nations headquarters, representing the voices and the issues that our youth members care about. And then, of course, we have another project that's coming up this year is our Youth Declaration for Human Rights. And that has really been where we've seen such a huge display of youth leadership on a local level around human rights advocacy. And where we are right now, we've been hosting these various development sessions on different topics. So education, climate, housing, gender equality, employment, all these different issues. We've been hosting these sessions to really garner feedback from young people and hear what they're already doing in their communities. I think sometimes when we talk about youth leadership, we think, oh, they need to be given these opportunities. They need to be given education and resources to start taking action. But what we've seen is that young people are already doing the great work in their communities and they just need that amplified. And so I'm glad that we've been able to do that so far.
Absolutely. I love what you collect the two parts of the dots. One is about, the global issues, but how can we solve it locally. But it's also very good to have people come from different backgrounds. They might not even be American citizens, but they come from different backgrounds and they bring in their different aspects, like we talked about, culturally specific and BIPOC communities. And these are really like marginalized communities. And I also love what you talked about, the intersections about those SDG goals and the topics. But before we go further, because even for me, before I got involved with the UN and all of your associate projects, and I didn't really know what SDG. I know the first time I actually had to Google it. So if you can explain to our audience what SDG stand for, that would be great.
Yeah, so the SDGs are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and these are targets that we are trying to reach by 2030 in terms of achieving a variety of issues. So there are currently 17 SDGs, and it really ranges from a wide variety of topics, whether that's life on land and climate and the environment, creating more peaceful and more just institutions, more gender equality. There's really a myriad of issues, but I will say the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are a great framework for those who are looking to connect their local work to the global scale and to the United Nations. By kind of organizing these different issues through these different topics, it's really easy to figure out how your work relates to other people who are working in similar issues, but then also kind of see the myriad of social issues that the UN's working on and understand that these dots are connected. You can't really work on one SDG without working on the 16 others. And so I think it's a great framework, especially in terms of educating youth and young people about what the UN is doing and how they can get involved and how it relates to them, right? One thing we preach a lot about with our youth members is the power of using your own story to connect that to your advocacy or figure out your place in this world of advocacy. And so I think by looking at the SDGs and kind of figuring out which one speaks to you the most, that's a really good starting point for figuring out, okay, this is specifically what I'm passionate about. How can I find other people that are also passionate about this and kind of get started from there?
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for explaining that. Because like you talked about the intersections, there are so many things. And I recall that when I looked into, for instance, gender-based violence, which you've also talked about, that's not just a gender issue. That's also, the other equality issue. And it's the income, it's the education. Everything is like intertwined and connected with each other. And while we're, talking about the definitions, I would like to also ask you to explain that, I understand this year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you can dive a little bit into that, as well as what you just mentioned. And the reason why I asked is you mentioned the Youth Declaration of Human Rights. So maybe educate our audience a little bit more about both of them.
Yes, absolutely. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created 75 years ago. And with most resolutions at the United Nations, you have to keep in mind that we have to get, 195 countries to agree on the language of this resolution in order for it to get signed and, ratified and things like that. So the language of the Universal Declaration, it is pretty open-ended, right? They do touch on a lot of different topics, from citizenship to participation in government and civic engagement to housing, education, health. These are all things that were outlined in the Universal Declaration. And as you can imagine, our world has changed quite a bit in the last 75 years and continues to change. And so for us, and also youth voices weren't really centered, right, in the creation of this declaration, even though youth continue to be one of the most marginalized and vulnerable groups today in terms of human rights. And so for us, when we were thinking about commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, we really wanted to center youth voices, but also, amend the Universal Declaration to be more inclusive of our world as it is today. So whether that includes including, protection for youth online and in the digital space, the rise of artificial intelligence and how that impacts education, thinking about equality and social justice following a global pandemic. There are so many things that have happened and changed. And so being able to revisit the Universal Declaration through the lens of youth voices has really offered this very fresh perspective on looking at human rights and figuring out how we can make human rights advocacy more inclusive.
That's really amazing. to be inclusive, to have the youth voice represented. I recall that just this year, I think it was April, the National Crime Victims' Rights Week, and there were like, I think, survivor voices in this case, but really overall the voices. And we need our voices from our communities to be heard, and our youth are our future. Yesterday morning, I woke up and my whole schedule changed. And these days, it's like you have to adapt to the change and be adaptive. And in short, I was called to attend and speak at a press conference. In fact, that was a bill regarding, human trafficking and no trafficking in schools. But in short, our youth are our future, regardless, whether it's human trafficking, sexual assault, intimate partner relationship, teen dating, violence, and all of these. And there are so many areas that we need to cover, and only through the work that you all are doing that we need to do it together. And that really goes back to reconnecting what you said about the community and everything. So I'm curious, if someone is just like a passionate citizen but they might not be a youth, and how can they help with the youth issue?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think when we think about youth engagement, especially at the UN and in this global advocacy space, and we think about the world that Gen Z or the current generation has inherited, right? Whether that's in terms of climate change, economic instability, continued violence against women, and a stripping away of rights and for so many different groups in the United States, whether that's LGBTQ plus, women, immigrants, etc. I think a lot of times we place the onus of fixing these problems on the next generation, right? Because there is hope and there is power in the youth. But at the same time, none of this has to be done alone or in silos. And so I think there's so much potential and power in working intergenerationally and working with various generations, right? Because you can't build upon the work that's already been done if you don't bring all the generations together. And so I think when I think about the role of youth in this space, I think we have to also appreciate and show gratitude for those that came before us that did this work, and connect those generations or different groups of people together so we can learn from those who have been doing this work for a long time, while also offering a fresh perspective and a different way of looking at things, because youth do have a very unique perspective, especially the youth of today. And so I think it takes all different types of people from all different types of generations and backgrounds to really work together in this space.
You brought another two interesting perspective. I must say that you talked about the intergenerational connection and the work together, collaboration, or sometimes it might be even intergenerational in terms of mom and dad with the son and her daughter. And I recall, as a matter of fact, was my last UN meeting in New York City. I met with a gentleman not connected with the UN, but in the human trafficking field. And he was like, it's really just like basic parenting. So if you love your child, just like the old-fashioned way, like you give them the time, instead of say, okay, I buy you an iPhone, I'm using an example, or with a PlayStation, or am I outdated? I don't know. Something like material, but really show the care and spend the time with them. Then they wouldn't want the attention from a stranger who will groom them, which goes to the digital age of like online grooming, online exploitation, and that's where all the bad news starts. The sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. So with that, I would love to hear what you think about as far as the not necessarily like parents, maybe they don't have children, but maybe what if you have like your aunt or an uncle from your brother or sister's children, or maybe you don't have brother, sister, a neighbor, or your good friend's children. I mean, how would you suggest the adults to assist with the prevention of these kind of heinous crimes? And I'm sorry I had to call them heinous crimes.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think as you were speaking, I kept thinking about mental health advocacy, because I think when I think of sort of generational trauma, when I think of, family trauma and things like that, and how a lot of times the vulnerability of groups that end up getting trafficked or youth that end up in precarious situations, sometimes it starts at home, right? Not feeling supported at home, not feeling seen, not feeling understood. And so I think one common thread that I've seen in a lot of the sort of youth-led human rights work is this huge attention on mental health advocacy. And I think as we're on the topic of talking about generational differences, I think the way we look at mental health and understand mental health and validate mental health issues today has changed drastically compared to maybe like my parents' generation or the generation before that. And so I think, my advice to parents or even teachers or anyone who's kind of trying to understand young people today, especially through the lens of protecting them from predators and opportunities where they could be harmed, I think it's to really take into consideration the mental health of our generation, whether that is sort of this existential exhaustion that we all feel, whether it's the collective trauma that we all just experience with the pandemic, or just, validating the way people feel and understanding that mental health issues are very real and that we need support and resources and continue to share that, whether that's therapy or support groups or even just online resources. I think the more we give attention to mental health, the more we can kind of work on healing individuals, but also collectively, and hopefully preventing kind of this vulnerability or susceptibility to, wanting to hang out with the wrong people, so to speak, not to trivialize it. But I think another piece of advice too is when I think about, older people working with young people or just trying to empower young people, I think two things come to mind. The first is, as I mentioned earlier, not handing off society's problems to young people and saying, okay, my generation couldn't fix it, but hopefully you guys can. Good luck. I don't think that's the right approach. I think there are lessons to be learned at any age. And I think understanding and participating in, social change at any age is helpful. And I think supporting youth, whether that's supporting youth in their strikes and supporting youth in their digital advocacy or supporting youth with funding and opportunities and not just tokenizing youth and inviting them to speak in spaces, but really providing, adequate resources to help them do the work that they want to do. I think that's important. But sorry, I lost my train of thought when I was thinking about my 2 points for better supporting youth, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really good that you touch upon the mental health issue. I think in my case, I come from China, and mental health is like, I remember growing up in my generation. So it's like 2 generations and 2 different culture. But in short, I grew up, if they say, okay, I'm depressed, no, that means you're crazy. So
Yeah.
people were like, I'm not gonna go see a psychologist. And in fact, I'm curious, like, are there actually, mental health, let's say therapists? Are there psychiatrists? Are there even medication? I actually do not know. And this makes me think like, I need to do some research and see what I can do to help on the other side of the world as well. But even like within this country in the United States, like you mentioned about the generation and awareness about the mental health, I always say that especially for survivors, it's like, whether and I learned so much for, let's say, intimate partners. It doesn't have to be married or teen dating violence, but I used to think violence is someone beat someone else up. That's my definition of violence. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just sort of like the dictionary of the version of the violence. But then I learned, oh, okay, there's actually, financial abuse, there's emotional abuse, psychological abuse and everything. And the way I interpret that is, and it's true that, you can have a scar. I mean, unless it's like permanent damage, like brain damage or some people, unfortunately, as I mentioned, might be deceased. Most of the people, their scars will heal, but their brain would not. I mean, I recently I came across something that I saved before. It was 2 brains, 2 scans of the brains. One was a healthy brain. One was someone who has been through trauma. There was hollow literally inside the brain.
Yeah.
So the chemistry actually changed. And going back to, what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So for children, especially when they are underage, their brain is not fully developed. And so when it comes to, trauma and mental health, I mean, this is like a whole other interview with you to talk about that. But I'm so glad you bring, to the awareness to our audience regarding the mental health. I think that really has to be addressed. Um, I also wanted to, ask you, you mentioned about the digital and the AI. I think it's really true. And I feel like I get stressed out. I'm like, okay, today we're doing Zoom, that's fine. But Teams, and yesterday my face was turned upside down. I'm like, what happened? What happened? And I'm like, just they're panicking. And then tomorrow I need to make a presentation on WebEx. And then I'm like, okay, how do you set the virtual background? I'm all panicking about technology. So I can only imagine, the different generations. And I even know people, they were like, no, I don't use FaceTime. I don't use a tablet. I just have like a, what you call that, flip phone. My friend told
Oh,
me like,
wow.
I use the flip phone. I said, but if you get him a regular phone, then you can FaceTime. But he didn't want to do it. Because like older people, especially when you get to a certain age, don't like changes. So it's really amazing, the younger generations, they have the AI and all the digital stuff, but it's good and bad, right? So you mentioned
Yes.
that earlier. So I would love you to sort of expand on that, because really we're at the time of digital age and things are happening so fast. The good people can use that to do the good, and bad people can use that for the bad. And what are your advices for our youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a loaded question because with technology, especially ethical use of technology is one issue, and then protecting young people or people in general from violence, from hatred, from issues like trafficking online is a whole other issue. What I will say, what I think is unique to the young generation of today is that there is sort of this literacy in technology. And obviously, I'm making the assumption because we have gaps in access to technology, and not every young person, has an iPhone or a computer. But for the most part, young people kind of have an awareness of technology. And what I will say is, with that, even just looking at social media, for example, it is so easy to connect with people from around the world. And I think, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's great to foster community and to connect with like-minded folks like yourself. And it's great for using technology and social media, especially to advocate and to get that message out to the world and inspire other people to take action. And with, technological advances like AI and things like that, I think it does make things more efficient. And I think we can leverage it as a tool to making our movements grow and, in our digital advocacy work. But on the other hand, you have this kind of vulnerability of so much access. And with your digital footprint, I know there's a lot of rhetoric right now on TikTok about protecting minors online. Whether that's, posting about them, putting them in videos and things like that, because you don't know who's watching your content. There's so many layers of like needing to protect young people from online. But I will say is we need to advocate for better legislation in terms of data privacy and protection online, as well as the creation of AI and how it's being coded. Because there's a lot of issues in terms of implicit bias and so many issues around AI and how it's being coded. And I think it's developing at a very rapid rate. So I think we need to continue advocating for, like I mentioned, data privacy protection, and kind of the ethical, human-centered design of AI technology. And I think that's a great place to start. But I also think, when I think about being online and in this digital space, holding people accountable, whether that's holding large companies accountable, that use and sell our data accountable, or just holding other communities and other people accountable online, and continuing to do that. And I think there's power in numbers when it comes to accountability. And so that would be kind of my advice, to young people or people working with young people, kind of looking at this space and the benefits, but also, the cons.
Yeah, I love listening to your perspective, and I mean, I just love your intelligence and your experience working in this field, and we'll definitely, look into that, and I'm sure our audience will look into that as well. And I cannot say thank you enough for the great work that you do with the UNA and our youth, our future. So before I let you go, is there any call to action or anything you would like to say to the audience?
Absolutely. So my call to action would definitely be to get involved with UNA if you're not already a member, whether that's joining one of our chapters, if you're a youth member, signing on to our youth declaration and participating in the drafting of that declaration. Allies and non-youth are also welcome in that process. And then, of course, at UNA USA, we have different affinity groups for different topics, whether that's UNA Women, Human Rights, Youth. We have a climate one that's being formed soon. And so be participating in our national events as well as our affinity group events and our chapter events is a really great way of staying involved. And one event that you can kind of keep on your radar on human trafficking. So that's a great testament as to how we continue to engage in ending gender-based violence and protecting young women and girls, both domestically, but also internationally. So I recommend joining our community. There's so many different ways and projects that you can get involved in. So yeah, thank you so much, Eileen, for your time. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Well, it's an honor for us to have you, Rachel, and thank you again for your time.